Hey y'all, it's Lindsay. Sorry, I'm looking a little bit less professional than usual. It's, evacuation and COVID and all of the things, and we're under a warning at our house right now, so this is what you get. Real life, right? So anyway, this week we are going to talk about mental illness signs and symptoms. At least we're going to start talking about them. We'll do some more sort of stuff with them next week. We'll talk 4 of the major mental illnesses this week, and then another 3 next week, and then start talking about like what therapy looks like and how do we treat these sort of things. One of the things I always like to preface with is there's a lot of stuff we don't know. As we have learned in this class, the history of actual mental health and mental illness is not as long for our sort of knowledge base as it is for our physical health. We've only really been sort of in the modern era of mental health for about 70 years. And there's still so much that we don't know. A lot of it is because of mental illness being an invisible sort of factor. A lot of it is because of stigma. A lot of it is there's just still stuff that we're discovering. The cutting edge of mental health is right here, right now, and we're finding new things out all the time. The stuff that we'll talk about in class this week and next week is a brief overview. One of the things that people often do is they start to diagnose themselves whenever they start reading through all these sort of stuff. And so I just want to remind you, this is not diagnostic. These are just sort of things, and it would take a qualified mental health professional to be able to diagnose you with a mental illness. This is a way for us as health educators or other people sort of working with the public to be able to sort of have a general understanding of what somebody with a mental illness might be suffering from, or if somebody's presenting in one of our programs, we might see some sort of patterns and other sort of things that we would say, hey, maybe you should go to a therapist or to a doctor and sort of talk to them and see what it is that they could help you with. For the purposes of this class, we're going to talk about the major sort of mental illnesses. So we always say like MMI, major mental illnesses. Those are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety and panic disorder, major depression, borderline personality disorder, and dissociative disorders. There are lots of other disorders that kind of mix and blend and have similar qualities or are more sort of new diagnoses and other sort of things. So this is why we're going to stick with the major ones, because these are the big players in the world of mental health and illness. And so this week we'll talk about schizophrenia, bipolar, OCD, anxiety, and panic. And then next week we'll talk about depression, borderline personality, and dissociative disorders. Okay, so one of the things that I have in the slides are these mental health monsters. As you know, like to think about things in sort of big picture, roundabout sort of ways. And so this is from a series from an artist who spent some time in a mental health hospital for himself. He talked to lots of people suffering from mental illness, and after he got out, he decided to work on this project of making sort of these mental illness monsters in a way to sort of get people to understand what it's like to have a mental illness if you're not somebody who has one. And so he worked with a whole bunch of different patients who had different sort of levels of mental illness, and he worked on compiling these monsters with descriptions based on the mental illness that they suffered from, in order to try and give people sort of a picture of the inside view of what it looks like to have mental illness. And so those are throughout. There's several of them. I think they're just a neat sort of way to think about it if you're not really familiar with these sort of things. For each of the mental illnesses, I give you sort of an overview. What are the big picture sort of things? What are the symptoms of the illness? Some have more symptoms than less. Talking about sort of the causes and risk factors, and on all of them, pretty much the theme is it's going to be a mixture of genes, environmental exposure, and brain chemistry and structure. And that's because we simply don't know. There's not one thing that causes mental illness, and there's not one thing that we can trace to say, hey, here's the definitive answer on mental illness. It's usually a mix of all these sort of things. And most of our answers are like, we think it's like this. And so that can be really frustrating, right? Because we would love to be able to point to like, oh, here's the pathogen, here's the thing that causes it, here's what the fix is. Well, mental illness doesn't work that way, right? We have we think it's related to this, but there could also be some of this, and so maybe this will help, which is where we get really frustrated with ourselves in terms of mental health and illness. When it comes to treatments and therapies, there's going to be a variety of approaches that are recommended, and this is where I'm going to pontificate for just a moment. Most mental illnesses will have pharmaceuticals that are important in terms of treating these sort of things. Now, I know that the pharmaceutical industry is wretched, and they do a lot of shady stuff, and they have a lot of issues. Those things are all true, but also something else that is true is that a lot of people need pharmaceuticals to be able to survive. I'm one of those people. I take a daily pharmaceutical for my OCD and my anxiety. If I didn't take those, it would be really hard for me to operate and function. But because I take medication, I'm able to be a professor. I'm able to do sort of my life in a pretty regular sort of way. And so it's really important to me for us to talk about sort of anti-medication stigma. There's a lot of people out there who think like, yeah, you're only taking medicine because you're weak, right? Would we tell somebody with cancer, like, well, you're only doing chemotherapy because you're weak? No, that's ridiculous, right? And so for the same thing can be said for mental health medications. Now, is it true that we overdiagnose and that we do a lot of weird stuff with mental illness in terms of, oh, this is not a quality we want to work with, this is an easy fix? Yes, we do a lot of that, and those are valid sort of critiques. We just have to be very calm and centered in our critiques of pharmaceuticals and overdiagnosis, because these things actually do help and they are necessary, particularly for some of the major mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Most people need to be medicated. If they're not, they can't operate, right? And so when we send these messages of like, oh, you don't need to take a mental health medication, you just need to go out in nature and you just need to try harder, that's really defeating for people who actually do need some mental health medication to be able to work and survive through their lives, right? So I am very passionate about these sort of things because of that. Another thing that we have to recognize is that we should always have medication and therapy working hand in hand. Okay, here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that therapy is really expensive and really hard to get to. So I just mentioned that I take a mental health medication. My prescription is $5 a month for my medication. $5. I have another prescription for if I have a panic attack. The last time I filled it, which I don't fill very often, for 30 pills of a medicine to soothe an anxiety attack, it cost me 78 cents. 78, right? Now, I do go to therapy because I'm privileged and fortunate to be able to go to therapy. And my therapist charges $150 for an hour and a half session, which is what I do. Even with really good insurance, which I have through Chico State, it costs me out of pocket about $60 every week to go to therapy, right? So if I go to therapy every week, so 4 weeks in a month, $60, right? $240 for therapy versus $5 for my daily mental health meds and 78 cents for panic and anxiety meds, right? So yeah, of course, everybody should go to therapy and take medication. However, medication is way cheaper and way more accessible for most people. And so that's why it gets prescribed a lot and why people take it rather than go to therapy, because therapy is really hard to get into and it's very costly, right? So just keep that in mind when we're critiquing sort of the over medication and the over prescription of things. Some people can and do need these things, and then sometimes this is the only thing that people can afford, right? And so I always say, yeah, it's best if you have medication and therapy, but if you can't afford therapy, well, then at least get the medication because it might be a helpful sort of thing. The other thing that I'll talk about in terms of medication is talking about the fact that it doesn't make things go away, right? A lot of people have this idea that you take your pill and then everything's fine. fine. That's not actually how mental health medications work. When we take a pill for our mental illness, what it does is it reduces the amount of side effects and the amount of strife and the amount of disruption to our lives, but we still experience those things, right? I have OCD. OCD is about obsessive compulsive thoughts, and I still have obsessive compulsive thoughts. I just have them at such a low grade that I'm still able to function with my day, that I'm able to be like, Linz, this is not a real thing. Let's just keep moving. It's with people with schizophrenia who might be experiencing delusions or hallucinations. They might still experience those even on medication, but they'll be like, yeah, that is definitely not real. And their brain is able to say, yeah, that's not real. And so just keep moving about your day. And so I think that's a really important sort of thing. People think that taking medicine is the easy way out and it just alleviates everything. And that's not true. It helps to reduce symptoms. It helps to reduce sort of the intensity of these effects. But you still have to work on these things every single day, which is why, if you can afford and access therapy, why those two things go hand in hand. Now, I also have included some brain scans in the lecture slides. Brain scans are really important. They're not the only thing, and oftentimes they are based on small scale sort of research. And so they're not the definitive sort of diagnostic tool, but they are something that can be really important. A lot of things that develop in terms of mental health do have some sort of biological or physiological origin. And so we are able to see this through MRI scans or CAT scans or other sort of things. Both MRIs and CT scans are really expensive, and so it's not a tool that we use for diagnostic sort of stuff. We go with sort of basic diagnostics of mental illness, but from there we do have some good information looking at sort of brain scans of people who are affected versus unaffected. And so I've included some of those in here. Finally, the biggest part of this week is listening to stories of people who have mental illness. I think it's really important, rather than knowing sort of all the, symptomology and checking off all the check boxes of here's this, here's this, here's this. What is it like to have a mental illness? What is it like to live and experience and be able to talk about these sort of things? And so I've included different videos this week from a variety of sort of perspectives and a different sort of takes on mental illness, of people with mental illness talking about their lives. That is the most important thing that I want you to take away from this. Yes, I assume you can all read my lecture slides and you can look at all the signs, symptoms, all the sort of causes, diagnosis, treatments, et cetera. But what I want you to really take away is, what is it like to be a person with mental illness? As much as you can possibly understand, maybe you yourself have mental illness, so you know some of this. Maybe you have people in your family who are mentally ill, and so you've experienced it already up close and personal. But I think it's a really important thing to just listen to people with mental illness and be able to hear them in their own words talk about their lives. All right, that's it. So this week is just lots of mostly listening to people with mental illness, reading about some things, and other than that, take care of yourself. Let me look at today's moment of zen is a power nap. Oh yeah, power naps. So naps are great, right? Everybody likes to take naps. But a power nap is actually a very specific sort of thing, right? A power nap is something that you have to train yourself to do, and it can be really rewarding, and it can be actually really helpful. Power naps are very specific in terms of gathering your brain cycle in your sleep cycle to be able to maximize the rest efficiency with that. When you nap for just a little bit of time, you are able to get some nice sort of quick relief of sleep. A lot of people are like, how can you nap for 2 minutes? You actually can if you work and you train on these sort of things. Longer naps between 5 and 20 minutes do a lot of rejuvenation for your brain at a deeper level. If you sleep for that 20 to 25 minute nap era, that actually gets you through an entire sleep cycle of light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, which is the really important kind of restorative sleep, and then back around to the light sleep. And so the goal is to sleep for that 30-minute cycle if you're able to. If you take a longer than 30-minute nap, that's fine. It's just not a power nap. It's just a regular old nap, and naps are good too. But there's a lot more about power naps that you can learn, and I'm going to include some links for that as well. All right, I will see you next week.